from around the world. It's great to have everyone with us just ahead of International Women's Day. What a time to celebrate the amazing achievements that women have done around the world, but also think about the huge steps that we need in political and social circles to still make change. And it's a pleasure to be your moderator today. My name is Molly Thomas. I am a freelance host and correspondent based in Canada. I'm also the 2023 Michener-Deakin Fellow, who has a focus on the loss of school for Afghan women and girls. And so I just came back from Pakistan speaking to resilient, amazing Afghan women, many journalists as well, who have lost their jobs because of what has happened in their country. And so it really gives me a privilege. It reminds me of the privilege we have to even have these conversations today. I want to welcome everyone here to the discussion, Truth Telling in a Polarized World. It's put on by the Coalition for Women in Journalism. I understand we have a range of people listening in today, fellow journalists, academics, human rights activists, policymakers, maybe some government officials as well. It's great to have you, and we want everyone engaged in the chat. We have an amazing lineup of journalists, but we want you to be weighing in as they speak. So we have a live chat on the YouTube page. Please weigh in with your questions, and we'll try to get to them in real time so that we can get these ladies talking about these different issues and speaking right to your questions. So let's get to our panelists today. I'll give you a short introduction of each of them. We'll start with Rula Jebreal. She's an award-winning journalist. Maybe give us a little wave, Rula, just so everybody knows. Rula is an award-winning journalist, foreign policy analyst, and best-selling author. She's a visiting professor at the University of Miami, teaching a course called Propaganda and Genocide right now. She's also been instrumental in creating a scholarship program for Syrian, Afghan, and Ukrainian refugees at the American University of Rome. Born in Israel, she's of Italian Palestinian descent, was the first foreign-born TV anchor in Italy. Her journalistic work reporting on the far right in the country has actually led to years of intimidation, surveillance, and smear campaigns. We're going to talk about that this morning. Good morning, Rula.
Good morning.
Good morning from me. I mean, it's midday for me here in Canada. We'll talk about Emilia Șercan next, investigative journalist from Romania. She's also an author and associate professor at the Faculty of Journalism and Communication Science at the University of Bucharest. She's been awarded major academic fellowships and scholarships for her work, including being recognized as an Erasmus Scholar and a Freedom House Fellow, amongst others. And some of her more recent work exposed plagiarism in the Romanian elite, including a former prime minister. After that, intimate photos were leaked of her as blackmail. This is all suspected to be orchestrated by people in one of Romania's ruling parties. And when she tried to fight that in court, the judge threw out the case, citing intimate photos are not a violation of privacy. Welcome, Emilia. Brandi Morin is next. She's an award-winning Cree, Iroquois, and French journalist from Treaty 6 in Alberta. Her reporting over the last decade has made her one of Canada's most prominent voices on Indigenous issues. Now, Brandi's debut memoir, Our Voice of Fire, a memoir of a warrior rising, was a national bestseller. She's won 2 National Native American Journalism Awards and a top prize in the feature reporting category of the Edward Murrow Awards as well. She was recently, though, arrested on obstruction charges when covering a homeless encampment in Edmonton. The charges have just been recently dropped. We will get into that with Brandi this hour. Last but not least, we have Amberin Zaman. Amberin is an award-winning journalist and senior correspondent for independent news source Al Monitor. She has reported from the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. And during her journalistic career, she has covered the Kurdish-Turkish conflict for many, including the Washington Post, the Telegraph, and the LA Times. Between 1996 and 2016, Amberin served as The Economist's Turkey correspondent. Her writing is really focused on minority rights. Amberin's had an interview with Turkey's opposition leader, which has led to some vicious online trolling, including death and rape threats. And we're going to talk about that as well today. Welcome to all of you women. Let me start with Rula, because I want to get into these stories that we just touched on. Rula, you are no longer in Italy. Talk to me about, do you even feel comfortable walking into that country, even if you don't have your journalist hat on?
Good morning, Molly, and good morning, everyone. Ahead of International Women's Day, I just want to remember that in the last 5 months, 103 journalists in the last 5 months were killed in Israeli airstrike in Gaza. Our colleagues, men and women alike, were murdered because simply they were showing us what was happening in this media blackout, where Israel prevented journalists from covering the war, where international journalists are not allowed to go there. The only eyes on the grounds are our colleagues who are risking their lives, who are getting killed, so the world can know what's happening in Gaza. I will go back to your question. Compared to the harassment and honestly the bullying, what's happening in Gaza, especially our colleagues, the bravery, I feel even embarrassed to talk about the situation in Italy, but it's all connected. And I truly believe that ethno-nationalists, autocrats, neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, all of these groups are allies, and they hate journalists and the media, and they consider all of us enemy of the people. And it's not a coincidence that I was the only journalist of color who was trying to expose and challenge the propaganda of the far right, especially the one led by Prime Minister Meloni and her coalition partners, who deployed and weaponized propaganda to criminalize, demonize minorities, and target journalists, anybody that tried to expose them. In order for them to control the public opinion, they needed to show people like me and you, obviously, as a threat. Because for them, it's ultimately about controlling the narrative, controlling the propaganda, and controlling the public opinion. And that's why they target journalists. My relationship with Prime Minister Meloni started in 2015, when I debated her after Trump won the elections. And the debate was about white nationalism and white supremacists and the use of propaganda. And I predicted Trump victory in an op-ed in the Washington Post, comparing him to Berlusconi, former prime minister, who had 3 TV networks and had total control and dominance of the media in Italy. And it was not a coincidence that he really tried to use disinformation, misinformation, and lies to control the public opinion, shape it, stay in power. And Meloni was, in her debate, I predicted Trump based on the model that Berlusconi employed in Italy. And when I debated her about Italy's history in fighting extremism, but also Italy's history in unleashing neo-Nazis and neo-fascists and specific laws targeting journalists, she couldn't hold the argument. It was a very fierce debate. It was on national television. She lost the argument, but I know from that day, because she stormed out of the studio after she called me crazy on live television. It's without, I was just arguing that the laws that they were implementing will undermine democracy, laws that were used by Mussolini and others, that her basically, trying to normalize or somehow try to whitewash the history of Italy with fascism was dangerous. Anyway, she stormed out, but I realized immediately that through her tweets, she was following everything I'm saying and attacking me day in and day out. As soon as she became prime minister, she wasn't even sworn in. She launched, she basically sued me in the court. She wanted to send a message to everybody. This is what happens if you challenge my narrative and challenge my propaganda. I tweeted immediately, I will not be intimidated, and I'm not intimidated. I will face her in the court. It will take time, and obviously it's costly, and but it was a message to my colleagues. This is the new era led by Meloni. And it's an era where journalists, anybody that dares to question her narrative and her propaganda will be targeted. Immediately after, I started getting rape threats, death threats. A far-right newspaper published basically, and this is when I realized it was becoming dangerous, basically published a letter from a mob lawyer who actually had an international connection even to the Colombian cartels, and he defended Colombian drug lords. He published an article in the main newspaper saying, if Meloni wants to sue me, he will pro bono represent her. That newspaper is the main newspaper used by Meloni's own party. It was a direct message that it's not only Meloni, the fascist, it was more than that. It was all the people, the corrupt, the mob, the mafia, the 'ndrangheta that are in Italy will view me as a threat and will use that leverage saying, well, you don't have to deal with her. We can't deal with her. And the fact that that newspaper, which is considered officially the newspaper or the propaganda organ of Meloni's own party, published that letter was a moment where I thought, okay, here we are, here we go. Then I start noticing that my phone calls to my daughter who lives in Italy were monitored. Every time I talked to her, it was clear that they were listening in. And it continued to be clear that they were listening in, monitoring. They start sending the police to basically my daughter's house, asking when I'm going back to Italy. This is a G7 state. Mm-hmm. This is a democracy. This is a European state. This is not Sisi in Egypt or any dictatorship around the world. And last week when she came to the White House and President Biden hugged her and gave her a kiss, for me it was a sign that in order for the leader of the free world, the leader of the free speech, right, to endorse a woman like this is throwing under the bus people like me and many journalists who live under police protection because the neo-Nazis and neo-fascists in Italy are coming after us. My best friend was Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed, butchered in an embassy simply because he was a guardian of the truth. He wanted to report about what the Saudis were doing. I'm not saying that it was a sign to all journalists in the Middle East, in the MENA region. This is what will happen to you if you dare to challenge autocrats and dictators. I never expected in my lifetime that a democracy like Italy not only will allow the likes of Meloni to intimidate, harass, and bully and sue people like us. I did not expect this to be ignored by the President of the United States. And I think it's very important today, if we really care about the survival of democracy and free speech and the safety of journalists, we need to pressure our politicians never to ignore the harassing of journalists, because it's a betrayal of every value we hold dear.
Thank you, Rula, for that important context. And it is important to acknowledge the journalists that have died. 2023, the Coalition of Women in Journalism just put out a report saying that 2023 was the deadliest time for female journalists in history. That report is out there. You can see every single face, every female journalist from a variety of countries, Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, Israel, and Lebanon, that sacrificed their lives in the midst of their jobs. So thank you for pointing that out. Let me go over to Brandi to understand your context a little bit, Brandi. You were just facing obstruction charges. They were just dropped last week. It's wild to me. I mean, that's a criminal offense in Canada that carries a maximum of 2 years of a sentence. What went through your mind when, a police officer put you in handcuffs when you were literally just out there doing your job?
Yes, Tansy, hi, Rula, for that. It's just mind-blowing what you are experiencing, and you are a warrior. Thank you so much for being here and sharing that. And hi, thank you, Molly. So I've been covering Indigenous conflicts for years and have been on various front lines in Canada as well as the US, where police or RCMP are enforcing actions against Indigenous land and water protectors. So when this arrest happened in Edmonton, in a city where I live not far from and in my home territories, it was really shocking, because I always thought that if I were to be arrested, that it would happen somewhere out in these remote territories, right? And I had been threatened with arrest before. I'd been harassed. I'd been intimidated, by police companies and industries, and surveilled, by governments. But when I was there documenting the police moving in to take down these homeless Indigenous individuals in Edmonton, the officer came at me and was blocking my camera and told me to get out of there. And when I did end up, in the back of a paddy wagon and in jail, and then facing criminal charges, I mean, it's something that you don't really understand the implications of until you go through it. So you can prepare for it. You can know that that's a possibility and that's a risk. But once you go through it, it's something else. And so for me, it was just a really dark, heavy, psychological, emotional storm and unknown that I went through. I mean, even initially when I was being held and when you have your freedom stripped from you. And, I have a little girl, a 5-year-old, and not knowing what was going to happen to her because nobody knew where I was. And the police telling me they're going to be holding me for days, and then not knowing what's going to become of your career, your reputation is being slammed and put through the ringer. And so, yeah, I am really, really grateful that as of almost a week and a half ago now, yes, that the charge was dropped, because now I feel like I have the freedom to, keep doing this work.
I mean, my question, Brandi, is in that situation, what supports helped you? And what supports need to be in place for journalists, whether they're freelancers or they're with a news organization, when things like that happen, especially when they involve Indigenous women, BIPOC women, maybe that historically or even now, like those relationships sometimes are not great with the force.
Oh, absolutely. And, I was blessed to have the support of my editors. I am a freelancer, but they just worked relentlessly on my behalf, getting, pro bono lawyers to represent me, and, gathering various press organizations, national and international, which stood beside me, as well as human rights organizations to, condemn the charges. Especially the Coalition for Women in Journalism was absolutely amazing. But I think, the police, whether it's the police or the RCMP, they obviously either lack the training and the knowledge when it comes to the press and the rights of the press, or they're willfully ignorant of it, or they don't care. And that obviously needs to be improved. However, the arresting and jailing of journalists in Canada is starting to happen more and more, and becoming the norm, that it's actually very, very concerning, because we are supposedly living in this democracy and like human rights champion of the world. And yet, the journalists, and I have to say that the journalists that are being targeted and arrested in this country, the majority of us are on the front lines covering the stories of the Indigenous people, of minorities, of these people that are there fighting for their rights. And yes, it is a different experience as a Native journalist to be arrested and targeted by the police, because there is a very dark and troubled history and current relationship that we have with the police. We have a genocide of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country. And the police have been complacent in not investigating. Some RCMP, have kidnapped our women and participated in the raping of our women. And so there are all these other factors, when we are arrested and targeted. There is absolutely no trust. Our people experience violence from the police at higher levels than any other race in this country. So, I mean, obviously, it's about repairing that relationship. And I think that where this situation may have fell short, whether they could have done something or actually had an influence, I don't know. But the governmental authorities on all levels did not speak out. There was a couple opposition members that spoke out about my arrest. But when you think about how integral free press is to democracy, and we had the municipal governments, the provincial and the federal, that were silent when my arrest was happening, that was concerning. And so going forward, if they spoke up to further, entrench our rights, then maybe this would have an influence on, these arrests in the future.
Thank you, Brandi. Let's go over to Amberin. you did an interview with an opposition leader that led to a firestorm online. You know, walk me through what it's like for you when you open up your social media accounts, when you go online, you know, after that, like, what is your life like?
The incident that you refer to is the least of my problems. That's like nothing compared to what I've been facing for long years, actually, because as you know, Turkey is an extremely repressive country and has become much more so under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the current president. And my troubles started from the get-go when I first became a journalist in Turkey, because I was focusing on minority rights. But I won't take up your time with that. Let's fast forward to Erdogan, who took power in 2002. And when he initially came to power, he was doing all the right things. He'd embarked on all these reforms, reaching out to the Kurds, trying to curb the military's influence, opening up to other minorities, etc., and encouraging free expression, women's rights, etc. So when I was the Economist correspondent in Turkey, obviously I was praising what he was doing. We were praising what he was doing. But then things sort of started to go south with him. And come 2013, we had these mass protests in Turkey where people were actually killed as government forces sought to suppress them. And that was sort of a turning point. And of course, we became extremely critical of him. And for him, that was, he's very thin-skinned. And it was particularly egregious. He thought that a publication like ours, which praised him for so long, had turned against him. Because, of course, that makes us much more credible. We're not we weren't among these knee-jerk critics of him just because he comes from an Islamist background. So when people like us, who gave him, a fair hearing to start with, turned against him, that of course was much more, I guess, challenging for him. So come 2014, he began calling me out in public. At several public rallies, he called me a sort of basically I shouldn't say the word, but insinuated that I was a dishonorable woman, that I was a militant in the guise of a journalist, all this sort of stuff. And so that, of course, triggered a whole, massive attacks online, because he has an army of trolls, and things just kept escalating and escalating. And I had a column with a Turkish newspaper concurrently with my job with The Economist. I was sacked from there. And then eventually my press credentials were revoked on the grounds that I posed a threat to Turkey's national security. Meanwhile, when I was in Washington, his bodyguards basically tried to beat me up and called me a whore and told me to leave the premises of the think tank where he was speaking. And of course, constant online harassment, and eventually he started, well, not him personally, but we all know he has big influence over the judiciary. Several criminal probes were launched against me on the grounds that I'm sort of a terrorist, basically. And in one case, there's a warrant for my arrest was put out. And this stems from a case that was mounted against an individual who's aligned with an Islamic fraternity that is alleged to have tried to overthrow Erdogan in 2016. And my crime was to have been in the same hotel with this man on a given date. I'd never heard of him, spoken to him, nothing, but that made me a suspect. And of course, this is all fabricated stuff. It's all aimed at discrediting me. And so since 2016, I have been unable to return to my country. I was unable to go to my mother's funeral because I know that I would be arrested, but it hasn't stopped. And so, you could ask the question, why am I still writing about Turkey? I'm writing about Turkey because I can write the stories that my colleagues, my very brave colleagues back home, can't write about, because if they did, they would go to jail. And there are many of them who are in jail. So I continue to focus my work on minorities. I go to northeast Syria, where I try to cover the abuses committed against the local population there, including Turkey's, massive military attacks, drone strikes, which have affected the civilian population. And of course, in order to deter me, what they've now started to do is sort of put out videos that show me being hit by a drone, sending the very clear message that, you know, if I carry on, that I'll get killed. But I really thank Rula for putting all of this in perspective. We are the fortunate ones. There are people out there, women out there, who are, you know, really putting their lives at risk. And of course, respect and yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Amber. And, you know, the underlying fear for so many women when they're being attacked online is that it turns up in real life. And you talked about being beaten up. And so I wanted to just ask the panel by a show of hands, you know, how many of you have experienced physical harm from a conversation that maybe started online because of your journalistic work? Has anyone else experienced physical harm? Just by a show of hands. Brandi, okay. And so globally, when you look at the numbers in 2020, you know, UNESCO polled journalists around the world and they say about 20% have. And then my next question is, how many of you have received threats of physical violence? By a show of hands. That's everybody? Okay. And then how many of you received threats of sexual violence?
These are the first threats that we usually receive, actually, when we are women reporting, you know, whether against autocrats or against dictators, and sadly, even if you report against people like Donald Trump, who were convicted of sexual violence, of rape. So it happens also in democracies.
Yes, for sure. And globally, 73% of women journalists say that they have experienced some kind of online violence. And that is, I think that's probably an underreported number, to be honest. I want to get to Emilia, you know, mindful of the time as well. What was done to you was abhorrent. I mean, intimate photos released online to intimidate you from the work you were doing around plagiarism in the top ranks of Romania. What makes it worse, though, is that the court didn't back you, Emilia. I mean, do you think that a male journalist, I mean, put this in perspective for us in terms of Romania, do you think a male journalist would have faced the same fate that you did?
No, for sure. But first of all, let me express my admiration for all of you. You are all examples of determinations and strength for all women journalists, I think, around the world. And I'm very, very honored to share this panel with you. I think I discovered a common point, let's say. So all of us were threatened, or after we faced the state power. So all of us had problems after we wrote about the political power. All of you knows that investigative journalists could be dangerous when implies wars or organized crimes or mafia or trafficking. But I will speak you about how dangerous could be when a journalist goes to the library, because everything is happening to me in the last almost 9 years is happening because I became, let's say, specialized in discovering plagiarism in doctoral dissertation. In Romania, it was very fashionable for politicians and state officials to have a doctoral degree. But many of these doctoral degrees were obtained plagiarism or imposture. And I discovered this because myself, I defended my doctoral dissertation myself in 2013, and I understood through all that years how complicated, how tough it is to become a PhD, to gain a PhD. And I understood that our politicians, they couldn't basically succeed to finish their research, their scientific research, in the same time they were in the parliament or in the European Parliament or in the government or in other very important position. And so I wrote in all these years after ministers and chief of intelligence services, and also about chief in the Romanian police, in the army, prosecutor, judges. Probably I wrote about more than 150 articles about plagiarism and imposture in the Romanian academia. And in first, of course, I would not tell you about online threats and discreditation campaigns, but I will speak you about the first major threat I received in 2019, when I was threatened with death after I wrote that the rector of the Police Academy plagiarized his doctoral dissertation. Police Academy is the institution that is training the future police officers. And the rector and the vice rector of the Police Academy, they basically organized this death threat against me. And they were investigated, prosecuted, and sentenced in 2022 to 3-year suspended imprisonment. But 2 years ago, in January 2022, I wrote that the prime minister in office in that moment plagiarized his doctoral dissertation. And it was a new threat after this. I received a new threat after this. And 1 month after, I received a message on my Facebook from a stranger who sent me 5 intimate pictures of me that were made 20 years ago by my fiancé. And one of anyway, so I discovered that these pictures were uploaded on more than 30 porn sites. And after I went to the police to file a complaint against this violation of privacy and the stole of my pictures, I basically I provided to the police officer a screenshot of the message. And 4 hours and 50 minutes, about 4 hours and 50 minutes after I provided to that screenshot to the police officer, the screenshot was published in media, and that article was spreaded in the Romanian media. And I don't want to tell you to give you many details about this case, but indeed the case was closed in late October. I contested the decision, and now we are in the court, and I hope to turn the decision back, and the file to be reopened, because the prosecutor said that it was not a violation of privacy that someone published the pictures on internet. And I also want to tell you that I'm facing something very recent, something that happened in the last days, in the last week, basically started, and it is something so outrageous, because it was for the first time, at least in Romania, when a state official, someone that is paid by the state, leaked an information about a journalist that made a public request information to that institution. And this happened last week, after I asked, and implies, as I told you when I start to speak about how dangerous could be when you goes to the library. So the director of the National Library leaked an information that was not public and was not intended to be public, about the subject of a new verification I was doing. He did it last week. He made public the fact that I had requested access to the doctoral dissertation of the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that is a Romanian. And he intends to run for a Romanian presidency. That is the elections will be in this year in September. So I wanted to see if his dissertation is was made according to the academia rules. But after I started verifying this doctoral dissertation, he leaked this info. Basically, not he didn't leak the information. He made it public on Facebook. He wrote on Facebook. Even I just replied to him, and I told him that he is disclosing an information that is protected by the European General Data Protection report, and he was not allowed to speak public about my request. And
another violation.
Another violation, yes. And after I wrote this, he also wrote on the internet that he replied to some comments in internet in his Facebook page that if I'm writing about the National Library, I will suffer. And he repeated this. And it's so complicated because we are in the European Union. We are at least in theory, we are a democracy, but all these things are happening, and all these things are implying state officials.
Yes, for sure. And in all of your cases, and it's constant and it's pervasive. And when we look at, these different kinds of online threats, like Emilia pointed out, discrediting her. We see doxing, where they're actually putting your name and address out for people that are against you, dogpiling. You see like misogynistic groups jump onto female journalists and terrorize their lives. This is a big problem. And for people, that are outside of the field that are listening in, like, talk to female journalists in your community, ask them what they experience, and you'll get a portion of what some of these ladies are sharing. Ladies, there's so much to talk about. I could do a documentary on each of you. But let me move into the next section. We have about 20 minutes here. So I want to talk about the future of journalism as a whole. Obviously, there's been a big tsunami of change across the world, especially in broadcast. When we think about traditional legacy media, if I think about North America and the US last year, media job cuts were, 48%, or up 48% from 2022. Advertising revenues are killing things. Canada's largest broadcaster cut 6,000 in the last 6 months. I was a part of that as well. It has been like relentless, and a lot of women are a part of that tide. And I Googled each of your countries, and every single one had cuts within them. So let me ask you, Amberin, let me come to you. When you look at the future of journalism, what do you like about the disruptions, and what are you worried about?
Oh, I think like many of us, we're worried primarily about, AI, for one, and artificial intelligence taking over our jobs, basically. And it's very hard to really distinguish between an article that's written from scratch by someone like myself and someone who just uses AI to produce that. I find that rather terrifying. I also, I think there's also the matter of people using my information I produce to in turn produce that kind of content, so there's so many layers to this. And of course, all the disinformation, the fake news that's floating around, and the polarization, and the sort of fact that almost everyone now can become a journalist of some kind, thanks to all these different platforms. And unless you're really discriminating and sort of thinking critically, you may just consume all that and believe that it's real, it's true. And I find that extremely disturbing.
Yeah.
And of course, it makes our lives much harder because, as you said, this proliferation of media, of news that comes from all these different sources, of course, is forcing real newspapers to really cut back in a way that's also, of course, harming all of us.
Yeah, I always think, citizen journalism is a double-edged sword. On one end, who are these people? What are their credentials? How are they reporting? Who's vetting? But on the other end, if I look at somewhere like Gaza, I mean, they are the lifeline for us to know what is happening in that area. Rula, let me come to you on that. I mean, where do you sit when you look at, the ever-changing technological world of journalism, and what's exciting about the future, but what also is like, oof, I'm a little worried.
Look, before anybody else, autocrats, dictators, regimes, but also anybody that is, even operating in a democracy, they all learn how to weaponize propaganda and disinformation and lies, and it led to real life consequences. So I have, an ambivalent feeling about obviously what's happening in our media, how we are normalizing all of this. I mean, there's a huge responsibility of our media, of our colleagues, of our newspapers, of our newsroom to hold the line. As much as I look at, the investors and the business model of it, I think we're failing, literally failing. I mean, there's multiple articles during this Gaza war where you could see directly that the person who wrote those articles were Israeli officials who work with Israeli security agencies, and there is no vetting. And those articles led to real life consequences, to people basically saying, well, if Palestinians are barbarians, let's kill them. It's fine to kill them. I mean, I live in liberal New York, and the sheer amount of liberals telling me in my face that it is okay to starve Palestinian civilians because of unvetted story about 40 beheaded babies that never happened, but was repeated by multiple people in our media organization. This echoes the same lies that led to the Iraq war, the WMD, weapons of mass destruction. They were not vetted. The Bush administration used the New York Times to launder their policies and basically create the case for invading and destroying Iraq. Again and again, we keep failing. We cannot wait until the dust is settled in Gaza to realize. I am proud of the Israeli journalists that exposed of Haaretz and Channel 14 and Channel 13 that said there was never 240 beheaded babies. And yet that story was never retracted. It was repeated by the President of the United States. This is how you manufacture consent for atrocities, for war crimes. You actually can manufacture consent by weaponizing fear and disinformation. We learned this in Ukraine. We learned this in Europe. We learned this through the history of this world. And yet, our colleagues and our news organizations, and sadly our newsroom, they lower the threshold of, I mean, we had a colleague sitting in Columbia University, a journalism school, and telling students, and it's on video saying, well, my job is not to verify the facts. That's a lawyer jobs. If you cannot verify facts, you're selling not news. This is not information. This is not journalism. I don't know what it is, but it's not journalism. There's a difference between journalists that you verify and it's thorough, it's vetted, it's verified, that the public opinion can trust it. But if you're willing to lower the threshold, then you discredit not only the news organization that you belong to, you discredit all of us. People died. Our colleagues in Syria, were killed. Women were killed in Syria, in Iraq, across the Middle East, everywhere to report the truth. I mean, Mary Colvin would go to Syria to report about those war crimes, and she was targeted by the Assad regime. When after killing her, they threw a party. And here, comfortable from our news organization, we're unwilling to challenge the narrative that, certain stories need to be verified before being printed. And I'm sorry to say this, when it comes to the life of people who look like us, who are people of color, who are women, who are indigenous, who are not Christian and not white, that threshold is thrown out of the window. And we need to call out the biases and the prejudice in our news organization. That is a threat, not only to democracy, that is a threat for our lives. That makes put our lives in danger, because then you give a license to the other side to say, well, kill them all. Under my house in East Jerusalem, where my family lives, there's a huge sentence. You're all guilty for October 7th. That's a line that's been repeated, that nobody is innocent. And you know what? Once you unleash that kind of narrative, it endangers all of us, not only me, Molly, Brandi, all of us, because we are trying to be guardians of the truth. And then if you undermine, and make it loose with the truth and with fictions, one of my favorite scholars of authoritarianism was Hannah Arendt. And she said, the rise of authoritarianism happens in a society that cannot distinguish anymore between facts and fictions, truth and false. Let's remember those words when we talk about our future in journalism and the responsibility of our colleagues in also holding the line. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let me come over to Emilia. I think you've had 25 years in investigative journalism. Like that is, for some journalists, young journalists, they wonder where would you get funding to even do work like that? I know you teach young students. What are you telling them about the future and how to prepare to come into this world of journalism where, yes, you have AI bots. Literally, there's a 24-hour news GPT station you can watch on YouTube where it's fully AI. It's like, I think their tagline is like, not human. Like they just admit it. Emilia, what do you tell your students?
Well, of course, we are speaking a lot about the danger of disinformation, because don't forget, Romania has a very recent communist past. And we had a long autocratic regime in Romania. So disinformation, fake news, fantasy as Rula said earlier, it is a very big danger. And also in Romania, it's very powerful. The social media is very powerful, and many information are spreaded on disinformation. Basically, are spreaded on Facebook. We are a bit different by many other countries where journalists are using X for comments or for spreading information or for sharing information. In Romania is different because we are using Facebook, probably because we can post long comments and we can reply, and probably it's something cultural. And of course, we have some other specific threats, like the fact that media, a very important part of the Romanian media, is paid by political parties through with state money, because the state is paying the political parties. And this money are basically shared with media, and very few online outlets or independent outlets are not receiving this money. Basically, they rejected the offer to be financed with state money by the political parties. And another threat, I think it is a specific, a local one. It is the fact that the local media is very weak. Many of the local media outlets were closed in the last years, and also the local journalists are facing a lot of financial problems and editorial and independence problems. So yes, it's not a very happy future for us. And it's very complicated, especially for us, because we have 4 rounds of election this year. Basically, we will have elections for all possible elections, for local, Euro parliamentary, presidential, and I think will be a very important year for our democracy, because we also have the danger of right parties, of extreme with far right parties, and the propaganda of populist parties. So yes, it's very complicated for us, and the danger is not just has not just one face, has multiple faces, and we need to hold the line indeed.
For sure. I'm glad that you brought up elections, because not just Romania, I believe there's 64 countries and the EU with elections this year. I mean, basically half the world is going to be voting. This is so critical to have information that's available to you. I think I just lost a couple of people. Brandi had to jump off, and Amberin, I'm not sure, she had something to say, but maybe she'll jump in. Rula, let me come to you and ask about, because of this climate, because there's so many layoffs, because things are changing so fast, technology, is moving. Can you talk to me a little bit about being a freelancer, about a female freelancer, and what you need to a little bit demand, when you come to the table with original content?
So I tell my student at journalism school, you need to offer a perspective that they don't have. And most of the time, if you read most newspapers and or magazines, the same talking point are repeated over and over and again with different maybe dressing, but more or less. So if you are somebody who truly understands one topic or one issue, and that issue is not addressed in the media, you need to come up with that, offer it to multiple publications, create a name and brand for yourself somehow by catering to topics that nobody is talking about. Your job is not to talk about what everybody's doing. Your job actually to talk about what nobody is doing, and the silence of our media regarding so many issues that are taking place that are actually a threat. They acknowledge that there is a threat to democracy everywhere. As you said, multiple countries will be voting everywhere this year. What is the biggest threat to voters? Not knowing what they're voting for, not knowing the agenda of the candidates. Look at Brexit. If there's ever an example of how disinformation and propaganda was weaponized against people so they could vote against their own interest, was Brexit. And it was a deliberate act of certain groups that really, that for them displayed and spread widespread disinformation. And you know what they use as leverage? The prejudice of news organization inside the newsroom, their own prejudice and their own racism, so they can spread the kind of information and disinformation that was obvious about Turkey, 70 million, Turkish becoming part of the European Union. That was never going to happen. But the fact that nobody challenged those lies, nobody challenged the lies over and again, even during the Iraq war, and there was shutting of the conversation about, look, we are where we are in the conflict in Israel. It's because we were prevented for decades from debating policies that we knew would lead to more death and more destruction and more extremism. We were prevented because a lot of people in the media didn't want to touch the subject because they knew they were going to be attacked. So they censored themselves preventively. And here we are, we have a far-right government, we have ministers convicted for terrorism like Ben-Gvir, and other ministers like Smotrich, who says that he is a proud fascist. We arrived to that point precisely because of failure of our media to tell people the truth, to examine policies. So again, I think we need to push back on those issues, and our young journalists are the best and the brightest and the bravest, because they don't have these prejudices. I see, if we know anything about what's happening in Gaza, and you talk about Gaza, anything happening in Yemen, anything happening anywhere, is thanks to those brave souls that risked their lives and were butchered in the process. So to honor their legacy is to persist on that path.
Thank you, Rula. And I know Rula has to jump off in a couple minutes. So thank you for being a part of the panel. Amberin, I want to come to you. We lost you there for a moment, but you're back. You wanted to weigh in on some of the discussion.
Yeah. There's some things that I should have mentioned that I didn't in terms of the challenges that we face. And one is the pressure from our own organizations to produce clicks, and I find that really, really difficult because there's so much focus on that, and it almost forces you to move away from the sort of much more granular stories that you would be doing. If you're covering a country like, let's say, Turkey, for example, you need to focus on domestic politics. You need to get, really dig deep into the ins and outs of domestic politics. Yet, because those sorts of stories don't get read as widely, and because there's this pressure to perform in terms of the number of clicks you get, you start moving away from them. And I'm sure that happens to many journalists and across news organizations in different countries. And I think that's also a very alarming trend, because the coverage is getting increasingly superficial, I find. There are a few angel investors who go in there, and like there's the New Lines magazine, I don't know if any of you are familiar with, but a very wealthy American Arab put a lot of money in it, encouraging long-form journalism, and God bless him. But those examples are few and far between. I'd also like to add that these digital platforms where we're putting ourselves out with our work, sort of showcasing ourselves in a way has also had a very distorting effect on us professionally, because we become so much more focused on ourselves, on our egos, on how many followers do we have, and that mirrors the pressures that are brought to bear on us in terms of clicks. What sort of tweet stories will get me more followers, and that sort of emphasis on showcasing ourselves, I find to be quite disturbing. And one final point is these very wealthy countries like the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that are investing in Western media. And, they do retain a lot of the original staff. But, we all know that those newspapers, those publications wouldn't dare to write anything, really critical of those governments that are investing in them. And we're seeing more and more of that. For example, the whole controversy over Saudi Arabia's bid to buy up the Daily Telegraph here in the United Kingdom.
Ladies, we've shared so much on this call, and I want to get to one of the viewers or the listeners' questions about, with all of these threats, discrimination, persecution, the state of the industry. I mean, what motivates you to stay in this industry? I know Amberin kind of touched on it before, but let me start with Emilia. What keeps you here, and why do you love this craft?
Well, I don't want to talk about today, to talk about my sleepless night, my struggles, my suffering, or my revel. But being a journalist, you basically are serving the public. And the most important thing I learned on all these years is to respect the truth and to respect the need of people to know. And basically, I know that I'm doing my job with a lot of I don't know, with a lot of involvement and passion. And I know that I need to do this because what I'm doing is a public service. And I think at a point I transformed my job into a mission, speaking about what is happening in the Romanian academia, and also what is happening with our local elite, political elite, that is morally corrupt.
Mm-hmm. Amberin, what drives you?
Well, as I said previously, the fact that I can write stories that people back home cannot, but above and beyond all else, it is, as Emilia said, a public service. And, we're recording history the best we can, as objectively as we can. And I mean, I love my job. I would never give up my job ever. I think it's such a gift, such a huge opportunity to be able to go out there and ask people questions and tell their stories, and in some instances, to be able to change their lives for the better, to help them. That's what motivates me the most.
Yeah, great. Journalism, especially around vulnerable communities, leads to great change, right? Can lead to great change and hopefully better societies. Ladies, what a pleasure to have you. And to our other panelists that have jumped off, we just really appreciate your time. For everyone here at the Women's Coalition in Journalism, we just thank you for being a part of the day, and have a great International Women's Day. Have a great day.